As for the number of pans you will use on the top of the stove, this mostly comes down to how much you cook. Certainly you need a good assortment of skillets and pots that are functional. These days there are a lot of gimmicky pots on the market though. Ask yourself if this is the sort of thing you would expect to see in a restaurant kitchen. Speaking of restaurant kitchens, most people would be pretty surprised to see just how old, beat up, and stained the cookware is in the kitchen of your favorite restaurant. The condition of those pans would have prompted most home cooks to throw them away long ago and replace them with something new and shiny. This might make you feel more comfortable when guests come over and see you have a beautiful gleaming set of pots on your state-of-the-art stove, but the reality is that you can turn out great quality dishes on beat-up pans and even a 30-year-old Russian Soviet stove. When it comes to braising pots, there are some special requirements, and a serious home cook needs to have at least 3 sizes of covered braising dishes available because the food needs to fit fairly closely into the dish, and obviously it is not always the same size of food that you're braising. Well, I'll come back to this in a moment. When selecting cookware, the primary selection criteria is the type of material that it's made from. There are many choices, and each one has its good points and its bad points that overlap, so let's take a look at them. Copper is traditionally considered the king of all cookware, but it's extremely expensive and it requires extensive, laborious maintenance. The main advantage is that it heats very evenly and quickly, and when it's removed from the heat, it cools very quickly, allowing for the most precise heat control possible. Plus, it heats so evenly that food is less likely to stick. So, if you don't mind spending $5,000 or $10,000 for a full set, and you either have an employee to clean it for you, or you don't mind spending hours cleaning it, then copper is the best choice possible. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we have steel pots that have been coated on the inside with enamel. These are very inexpensive, but they're not very durable. The coating scratches and begins to flake fairly quickly, and they heat unevenly and slowly. For these reasons, these are rarely used in restaurants. Next up, we have stainless steel. This is commonly seen in restaurants. It's fairly inexpensive and very durable. However, it heats the slowest of all the metals, and food sticks to it very easily. In a commercial kitchen, the slow heating isn't as much of a problem because you keep a stack of pans at the back of the stove already hot and ready to go, but that approach doesn't really work very well in a home kitchen. To combat the problematic uneven heating of stainless steel, manufacturers invented cladware, which has a layer of aluminum or copper sandwiched between layers of stainless steel. This does help to make the temperature more even across the surface of the pan, but it also makes the pan heat up even slower and cool down even slower, which makes precise temperature control impossible. It's also much more expensive, and over time and heavy use, the layers separate and the pan has to be discarded. Cladware is basically never used in restaurant kitchens for these reasons. The general rule of physics that you can't really get around here is that thicker materials take longer to heat up, but they do heat more evenly. And this is something to always bear in mind when selecting cookware. Which brings us to cast iron. It has its place in every kitchen, but it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. The biggest drawback is that it's highly reactive. You can't safely cook anything on it that's acidic, such as tomatoes or vinegar or citrus, at a high heat without it imparting a metallic taste to your food, and also damaging the pan in the process. Plus, cast iron requires seasoning and occasional reseasoning as maintenance, which takes time and effort. However, it is inexpensive and excellent for browning meats. Another old-school material is Pyrex, but it heats even slower than stainless steel, and it can shatter if it's dropped. Sometimes it shatters for no apparent reason at all, and the handles remain red hot to burn your fingers on. Trust me, sooner or later you'll find that out. No professional kitchen uses glass cookware, and you shouldn't either, except for baking in the oven, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. The next category is aluminum. This is the type of pan used in fast food restaurants because it's a real workhorse. It provides almost as much heat control as copper, it's inexpensive, and it's durable. However, like cast iron, you can't cook acidic foods in it without a metallic taste resulting. What's worse is that the aluminum that leaches into your food has been linked to numerous serious health risks, so I would never suggest using aluminum in your household. The exception, of course, is Teflon, where aluminum is the base metal underneath the Teflon coating. There are some scaremongers online that will try to tell you that Teflon is dangerous because of PFOA. PFOA is a chemical used to make Teflon. There is no PFOA in your Teflon pan. These people don't know what they're talking about. Now, the other argument that you sometimes hear is that if you heat a Teflon pan with nothing in it to over 600 degrees on the stove, that it begins to emit toxic fumes that can kill pet birds. Yes, that's true, but you should never leave a pan unattended on the stove anyway, and birds just happen to be extremely sensitive to that particular gas. Humans aren't. Teflon is very safe, although it does wear out quickly. Speaking of damaged and worn out pans, if you're using an electric stove, you have another factor to consider. The bottom of your pans needs to be perfectly flat in order to make good contact. If the pan rocks and wiggles around, it is not making good contact and it's not heating evenly. Of course, this isn't a problem on a gas stove. Now let's talk for a moment about the materials for ovenware or braising dishes. One company in particular has become synonymous with this type of covered vessel. They look good and they're durable, but frankly, they're more cookware than you need for this task. I prefer ceramic or glass braising dishes. Aside from being much less expensive, they maintain a constant heat better than metal does. When you set your oven to a particular temperature, the reality is that the heat source cycles on and off, and it can fluctuate by 20 degrees up and down from the setting inside the oven. In a metal braising dish, the sides of the vessel heat and cool rapidly following the oven cycles. In a glass or ceramic dish, the temperature is maintained because those materials heat and cool slower. The disadvantage is that it takes slightly longer to get hot in the first place, but on a long braise of several hours, that really doesn't make any difference. There are a few rules shown here for cooking with glass. The one you can ignore is preheating the oven if you're using it with a braise. If it's going to be in there for hours anyway, it makes no difference whether it takes an extra 10 minutes to get hot in the first place. The main thing is do not take a glass dish out like this and put it on a hot stove. It will shatter explosively faster than you would ever imagine, sometimes a matter of seconds. Always remove it to a dry cloth on a surface at room temperature. Experienced cooks know that the way to keep food from sticking to a metal pan is to put cold oil into a hot pan. If you look at the surface of a seemingly smooth metal pan under a microscope, you'll see that there are tiny cracks and fissures. Dropping cold meat onto this causes them to contract, and it literally grabs hold of the food. There's also van der Waals forces at work here, but that's too complicated to explain. When you put oil into a very hot pan, some of it cracks. I don't mean the cracks in the pan, I mean the same cracking that petroleum refineries use to make gasoline. At sudden high temperatures, the carbon-carbon bonds break and new compounds are formed. What we get is microscopic amounts of graphite that lubricate the pan, as well as alkenes that greatly reduce the electrostatic van der Waals forces. This only works if the pan is already very hot when you put the oil in it. As the pan gets hot, tiny cracks and fissures in the surface open up. If you put cold meat on the pan now, the cracks close and the meat sticks. When oil is added to a very hot pan, it superheats and cracks. Graphite bonds to the metal, providing a barrier against sticking. Now when wet meat is added, the oil causes steam to form instantly. The escaping steam is another barrier that helps lift the meat away from the hot surface by a tiny bit. When the steam stops escaping, the meat has a crust on it and is no longer prone to sticking to the pan. This principle works for any relatively low-fat food that you're trying to brown, including vegetables. If you aren't trying to brown them, then you can use a lower heat and add the fat at any point you like. If you're cooking a very high-fat protein, like a confit duck leg, then you can start with a cold pan and you don't add any fat. But these are rare and special cases. The general rule is to begin with a hot pan. That means a minimum of 200 degrees Celsius, and 450 degrees is generally better. Add the oil to the pan and swirl to coat. Wait 15 seconds. Add the meat that is relatively dry or lightly coated in oil. Now don't move it around for at least a couple of minutes. Let a crust develop. Also look for my cocktail book, Cocktails of the South Pacific and Beyond, Advanced Mixology, available through Amazon online.